mean that much to me, but somebody said, you know, it mightn't seem like much now, but it is history, and you'll enjoy it. So I went along, and I was glad.
For over 50 years, it's been one of the most whispered about relationships in music history. It was a bond forged in the shadow of the Mersey Beat, a partnership that built a global legend and a brotherhood that almost buckled under its own weight. Paul McCartney and George Harrison, the charmer and the quiet one. Their story is one of shared dreams on a smoky Liverpool bus, bitter arguments in a cold film studio, and a quiet, profound reconciliation when it mattered most. We've all heard the rumors of creative jealousy and of friendship strained to the breaking point. For decades, the story has been pieced together from hearsay. But what was the real story? Well, after decades of carefully chosen words, Paul McCartney is finally sharing the unvarnished truth about his bond with George Harrison. And no, it's not found in some explosive new scandal. It's in the quiet, heartfelt reflections of a man looking back on a life intertwined with his little brother. He's opening up about the private disagreements that nearly tore them apart and the deeply affectionate memories that truly defined their friendship. In this video, we're moving past the myths. Using Paul's own recent words, combined with a lifetime of archives, we'll uncover the real story of Paul and George, from the beginning to the bitter end, and to the love that remains. Every legend has an origin story. For John Lennon and Paul McCartney, that moment is famously at a church fete in Woolton. But for Paul and George, the story that laid the foundation for everything started somewhere much more normal and, in its own way, far more poetic. It started on a bus. Before they were Beatles, they were just schoolboys. Paul, a year older, went to the prestigious Liverpool Institute High School for boys. So did George, a quiet, younger kid from a working-class family. They wore the same uniform and shared the same daily commute on the number 86 bus. It was on these rattling, fume-filled journeys that a friendship sparked. Paul was outgoing, already obsessed with the rock and roll wailing from America. George was more reserved, but he had the same fire in his eyes. More importantly, he had a guitar. George recalled their meeting with simple clarity. "It was on that bus journey that I met Paul McCartney. I started hanging out with him." It was that simple. Two lads with guitars and a shared dream. Their bond was cemented over traded chord shapes and a mutual love for American music. It was a friendship built not in the spotlight, but in the everyday rhythm of life. They were so close they even hitchhiked to Wales together, a carefree trip that became a treasured memory. This early connection was crucial. When Paul joined John Lennon's group, the Quarrymen, he knew they were missing a truly skilled lead guitarist. Paul championed the younger George relentlessly. John, nearly 3 years older than George, was skeptical. He initially dismissed the 15-year-old Harrison as way too young for his band, but Paul persisted. He knew what George could do. The audition, fittingly, happened on the top deck of another Liverpool bus. Paul set it up for George to play the complex instrumental Raunchy for John. George nailed it. The performance was so flawless that John's reservations melted away. George was in. From that moment on, Paul wasn't just George's friend. He was his champion, his way into the inner circle. He had become George's big brother. It was a dynamic that would define their relationship for years, for better and for worse. Decades later, Paul shared a poignant detail that perfectly captures the subtle, lifelong differences in their personalities. He spoke of missing his pre-fame life, specifically riding the bus. "Yeah, I hate that I can't anymore," Paul said. "I really do. That's what I used to do all the time." It was a nostalgic longing for the simple freedom that had been so central to his youth. George, however, never quite got it. Paul recalled, "I remember when we got famous, I said, I miss going on buses, and George Harrison thought I was mad." The reason was simple. George is really into cars, and his dad was only a bus driver. He had a Ferrari, so what does he need a bus for? It's a small story, but it tells you almost everything you need to know. Paul, the son of a cotton salesman and a nurse, yearned for the common touch he'd lost. George, the son of a bus driver, was more than happy to leave the buses behind for a life of luxury. Two boys from similar backgrounds who took the same bus to the same school, but who were always, fundamentally, heading in slightly different directions. As the Beatles phenomenon exploded, the world slapped labels on them pretty fast. John was the witty rebel. Ringo was the lovable heart. Paul was the charming prodigy. And George was the quiet Beatle. The label stuck, and it wasn't entirely wrong. But behind that quiet facade, a formidable talent was brewing, and with it, a growing frustration. In the early days, the hierarchy was clear and mostly accepted. The band's creative engine was the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership. George, as lead guitarist, was an absolutely essential component. His intricate licks and inventive solos gave the band a sophistication that set them apart. But he was seen, both by the public and inside the band, as a supporting player. For a while, this worked. They were a tight-knit unit, a gang against the world. Paul was the best man at George's wedding to Pattie Boyd in 1966, the only other Beatle to be there. This points to a genuine closeness that existed even as their fame went stratospheric. But the recording studio is a pressure cooker, and it was there that the big brother, little brother dynamic started to crack. Paul, by his own admission, was a perfectionist. He had a clear vision for the music, a relentless drive that pushed the band to create masterpieces like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper. He was the de facto musical director, especially as John's interests began to drift. Paul's approach, however, could be overbearing. He wasn't just the bassist. He was often telling everyone else what to play. For George, this was a double-edged sword. Paul's musicality pushed him to new heights, but it also left him feeling stifled and patronized. The same dynamic that got a teenage George into the band now felt like a creative straitjacket as he matured into a world-class musician. He didn't need a big brother telling him what to do anymore. This frustration famously boiled over in a later interview where George claimed Paul ruined me as a guitar player. It's a shocking quote, and for decades it was used as proof of their hatred for each other. But the context is more nuanced. George wasn't saying Paul made him a worse player. He was venting the frustration of a lead guitarist whose every note was often dictated by the band's primary songwriter. He felt his own instincts were being shut down to serve Paul's vision. He wasn't allowed to just play, he had to play what Paul wanted. In a recent interview, Paul shed light on this very dynamic, noting that George's songwriting was deeply personal. His stuff is sort of biographical, McCartney observed. Here Comes the Sun? He's talking about his life. In contrast, Paul was a storyteller, a creator of characters like Eleanor Rigby. George, Paul recalled, was almost baffled by this. George, Harrison often said to me, "How do you do that?" He said, "How do you make these people?" And that right there, that was the heart of their creative tension. George wrote from his soul. Paul wrote from his imagination. When Paul directed George on a guitar part, he was trying to make the guitar a character in his story. But George, increasingly, wanted his guitar to be his own voice. This wasn't just a clash of egos. It was a fundamental clash of artistic philosophies, playing out under the most intense spotlight imaginable. The quiet one was finding his voice, and he was starting to realize that to be truly heard, he might have to shout. If the studio dynamic was the kindling, the battle for songwriting credit was the spark that lit the fire. To get the depth of this conflict, you have to understand the currency of the Beatles, the Lennon-McCartney credit. It was more than a brand, it was an institution. And for a budding songwriter like George Harrison, it was a fortress. George's evolution as a songwriter was remarkable. He started tentatively with Don't Bother Me in 1963. By the mid-60s, he was contributing undeniable gems. Taxman, The snarling opener of Revolver was a Harrison song. Within You, Without You, the spiritual heart of Sgt. Pepper, was his. He was no longer just a guitarist who wrote a little. He was developing a unique voice that blended Eastern philosophy with Western pop. The problem was getting that voice heard. On a typical Beatles album, George might get one, maybe two, song placements. John and Paul dominated the rest. For years, George accepted this. But as his confidence and his stack of unrecorded songs grew, his patience wore thin. He was writing masterpieces, only to see them get sidelined. Imagine being George Harrison in 1968. You've just written While My Guitar Gently Weeps, a timeless, majestic ballad. Yet during the initial sessions, the other Beatles seemed bored. They treated it as just another George song. It was only when a frustrated George brought his friend, Eric Clapton, into the studio to play the solo that John and Paul finally sat up and took notice. With Clapton there, the song suddenly got the respect it deserved. For George, it must have been both a victory and a deep insult. He had to bring in an outsider for his own bandmates to finally recognize his genius. This struggle continued right up to the end. During a meeting in September 1969, John actually proposed a new democratic formula for their next album: 4 songs each for him, Paul, and George, and 2 for Ringo. It was a radical idea that acknowledged George as a creative equal. But the conversation quickly soured. George complained, "Most of my tunes, I never had the Beatles backing me." To which a defensive John shot back, "Oh, come on, George. We put a lot of work in your songs." The wounds were too deep. The proposal was too little, too late. From Paul's perspective, he wasn't being malicious. He was the band's quality controller. He and John had a proven formula for writing hits. He may have genuinely believed his and John's songs were simply better, more commercial, more Beatle-y. But in doing so, he badly underestimated his little brother and failed to see that George's unique perspective wasn't a threat to the Beatles' sound. It was a vital part of its evolution. The ultimate proof of George's talent came with Abbey Road. It featured 2 of his songs, Here Comes the Sun and Something. Frank Sinatra himself would later call Something one of the greatest love songs ever written, famously and incorrectly attributing it to Lennon and McCartney. The song was so brilliant it was released as a double A-side single with Come Together. It was George Harrison's first ever Beatles A-side. It was a monumental achievement. But it happened in October 1969. John had already privately quit the band. The Beatles were, for all intents and purposes, over. George had finally won the battle for an A-side, but the war was already lost. He'd climbed the mountain only to find his brothers had already packed up and gone home. This wasn't just about track listings. It was a fight for respect. And it left deep scars on his relationship with Paul McCartney. Every long, simmering conflict has a breaking point. For Paul and George, that moment was captured on film in January 1969 in a cold, cavernous film studio. The Get Back project, later, the film and album Let It Be, was Paul's idea. He hoped to recapture the band's raw, early energy. But instead of bringing them together, the project put every festering tension under a microscope. The atmosphere was miserable. The Beatles were falling apart and cameras were documenting every painful second. Yoko Ono was a constant presence at John's side. John himself was often distant. Into this vacuum stepped Paul, trying to steer the ship with an almost manic energy. And the person who bore the brunt of it was George. The infamous argument is legendary, and it's painful to watch. It's a quiet, tense exchange, far more devastating than a shouting match. Paul, as musical director, is trying to guide George through a guitar part for 2 of us. He's being picky. George, who has spent years feeling musically suffocated, has finally had enough. He sits, looking tired and utterly defeated, and says with a chillingly calm voice, "I'll play, whatever you want me to play. Or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it. It's a moment of total surrender, dripping with years of resentment. This wasn't about a guitar riff. This was George Harrison, the man who wrote, "While my guitar gently weeps," being treated like a session player by the man he once looked up to. A few days later, the tension peaked. During a lunch break, George quietly announced, "I'm leaving the band now. See you around the clubs." And he walked out. He had quit the Beatles. It was a shocking act of defiance from the quiet one. He was eventually coaxed back, but only after the band agreed to ditch the dreadful Twickenham studios for their own intimate Apple studio. George had won the battle, but the incident laid bare the irreparable fractures in the group. For decades, the Let It Be film was the grim testament to the breakup, painting Paul as the bossy one and George as the sullen victim. It was only with Peter Jackson's 2021 documentary, Get Back, that a more nuanced picture emerged. The new footage showed that alongside the tension, there was also laughter, collaboration, and a deep affection that still existed between them. But, even with this new context, the argument remains a pivotal moment. It was the point where George stopped suffering in silence. The relationship between Paul and George was never the same. The trust was broken, and the only thing left to do was go their separate ways and finally speak their minds through the one medium where they felt truly free, their music. When the Beatles officially broke up in 1970, it was less a split and more a dam bursting. For George Harrison, a decade of creative frustration came flooding out in his monumental triple album, All Things Must Pass. It was an astonishing achievement that immediately reframed his entire career. He was no longer the junior partner. He was a creative giant. And on that album, he finally said everything he couldn't say to Paul's face. The most direct shot was a song called Wah Wah. For George, the title was a metaphor for the pounding headache of negativity he felt he'd endured. He wrote it the very day he temporarily quit the Beatles. The lyrics are a raw cry of frustration. "You've given me a wah-wah, and I'm thinking of you. You don't see me crying. You don't hear me sighing." It was a sonic blast of liberation from the creative confinement he'd felt. But perhaps the most personal song was Run of the Mill. Where Wah Wah was angry, this song was deeply sad, a lament for a lost friendship. It was seen by almost everyone as a direct message to Paul. George sang, "Everyone has choice. When to and not to raise their voices, it's you that decides. Though I'm beside you, I can't carry the blame for you." Then the heartbreaking lines, "Another day for you to realize me or send me down again." It was George laying his cards on the table, expressing the deep hurt of feeling constantly judged and dismissed. He was basically pointing the finger at Paul for their broken friendship. The songs on All Things Must Pass were more than just music. They were George's truth, a public airing of private grievances. Paul, for his part, was also processing the breakup through his music. His early solo albums are filled with themes of domestic bliss and escape. But some songs had veiled messages. Too Many People, from Ram, with its line, "Too many people preaching practices," was seen as a jab at John and Yoko. But other lines, like "You took your lucky break and broke it in two," could have been aimed at any of his former bandmates. The early 70s were a period of public feuding and private distance. The four men who had been closer than brothers now communicated through interviews and lyrics. For George, this was a time of immense creative freedom. For his relationship with Paul, it was the darkest of winters. The little brother had not only left home, he'd built his own magnificent palace. The years right after the breakup were frosty. The arguments over business and the lyrical potshots created a chasm between them. But time started to work its slow, healing magic. And tragedy, unfortunately, would speed up the process. The anger began to subside. They were no longer in competition. George was a star with hits like My Sweet Lord. Paul was dominating the charts with Wings. They could finally exist as equals without the suffocating politics of their old band. A major, tragic turning point was the murder of John Lennon in December 1980. The sudden, violent loss of their friend put all the old bitterness into sharp perspective. Squabbles over royalties seemed utterly insignificant. The shock reminded them of their shared mortality and the preciousness of their unique bond. Paul, George, and Ringo were now the only three people on Earth who truly understood what it was like to be a Beatle. This shared tragedy forged a new, more mature connection. Throughout the 80s and 90s, the friendship was quietly rekindled. They would get together for dinner, share family time, and just be friends again, away from the spotlight. The most significant public reunion came in the mid-90s with the Anthology project. For the first time in over 2 decades, Paul, George, and Ringo were back in a studio together, working on new music. They completed 2 unfinished John Lennon demos, Free as a Bird and Real Love. The sessions weren't without old tensions. George reportedly grumbled about Paul's tendency to take charge, but ultimately they were a success. The Anthology allowed them to reclaim their own history. More importantly, it allowed them to sit in a room together, older, wiser, and finally able to appreciate the monumental thing they had created. George, in the documentary, spoke candidly about the old dynamic, acknowledging that Paul often struggled to see him as anything other than the little kid he'd brought into the band. But there was an acceptance in his voice that came with age. Paul, too, began to publicly express his immense admiration for George's talent. The old wounds were finally healing. They had navigated the storms of fame, the bitterness of a breakup, and the pain of loss. What emerged was the bedrock of their friendship, the original bond between 2 Liverpool lads who just wanted to play their guitars. The final chapter of their story is one of profound sadness, but also immense love. When George Harrison was diagnosed with cancer, any remaining conflict evaporated. All that was left was the core of their relationship, the deep brotherly affection that had been there from the start. In George's final months, Paul would visit him. These weren't tense meetings. They were quiet visits between 2 old friends. In what has become one of the most poignant stories of their entire relationship, Paul described one of his last visits with George. It's here that Paul truly breaks. His silence, not with gossip, but with a moment of raw, human connection. I sat with him for a few hours, Paul recalled. George was frail, but his spirit was intact. Even when I saw him last time,